The detective said my DNA was found at the crime scene, but I'd been locked in county jail that entire week. Detective Raymond Kowalski slid a manila folder across the metal table in the interrogation room at Pierce County Jail. He was maybe 55, with gray stubble and tired eyes that had seen too much. He'd introduced himself as having worked homicide for 19 years. He looked at me like I was already convicted. "Your DNA was recovered from the victim's apartment," he said. "Saliva on a cigarette butt found near the body, blood on the doorframe, and epithelial cells under her fingernails where she fought back. The lab confirmed it's a direct match to your profile in the system." I sat there in my orange jumpsuit, wrists still sore from the handcuffs I'd worn for the past 6 days, and laughed. Not because anything was funny, but because the statement was so absurd my brain couldn't process it any other way. I'd been locked in a cell 60 feet from where we were sitting since last Monday morning. I hadn't left the facility except for a court appearance on Thursday, and that had been under armed guard through an underground tunnel. Detective Kowalski didn't appreciate my reaction. His expression hardened. Quote 2. "My name is Alex Brennan. I'm 32 years old. Until last Monday, I'd been working as a construction foreman for a commercial building company in Tacoma. I'd been arrested on Monday morning for a DUI I'd gotten 3 months earlier. I'd missed my court date because I'd gotten the date wrong on my calendar, so a judge issued a bench warrant for failure to appear. When I got pulled over for a broken tail light on my way to work, the cop ran my license and found the warrant. I'd spent the past 6 days in county lockup waiting for my rescheduled court appearance, which was supposed to be tomorrow morning. It was a misdemeanor DUI, my first offense, barely over the legal limit after having 3 beers at a coworker's birthday party. I'd expected a fine, maybe a suspended license, possibly an ignition interlock device. I hadn't expected to be sitting across from a homicide detective being told my DNA was found on a murdered woman. I told Detective Kowalski what I'd just been thinking. "I've been in custody here since Monday morning. You have records. You have surveillance footage. You have intake paperwork with timestamps. I haven't left this building. There's no way my DNA could be at a crime scene because I've been locked in a cell." Detective Kowalski opened the folder and pulled out several photographs. Crime scene photos showing a small apartment living room, furniture overturned, blood spatter on the walls. A woman's body lying near the couch, her face swollen and bruised. A child's drawing on the refrigerator visible in the background. "Michelle Strand was murdered on Wednesday night between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m., he said. The medical examiner set the time of death based on body temperature and rigor mortis. Her daughter said the man who attacked her mother came in through the unlocked front door while they were watching TV. He wore jeans and a dark jacket. He had short brown hair. He looked like the photo we showed her, which was your driver's license photo. The DNA evidence confirms it was you." I felt my chest tighten. Wednesday night, I'd been in a holding cell with 5 other inmates. We'd played cards until lockdown at 10 p.m., then lights out. I'd barely slept because one of my cellmates snored like a chainsaw and another guy kept getting up to use the toilet. I had witnesses. I had guards who'd done their rounds every hour. I had a jail facility with security cameras documenting my presence. But Detective Kowalski was sitting there, telling me my DNA, my actual biological material, had been recovered from a crime scene where a woman was beaten to death. The impossibility of it made my hands shake. I asked him how. How could my DNA be at a crime scene when I was locked in jail? He said that's what he wanted me to explain. He said people had escaped from jails before. He said maybe I'd had help from a guard. He said maybe I was lying about being in custody, that maybe someone had falsified records. His theories were desperate, reaching for explanations that didn't make sense because the evidence didn't make sense. I asked for a lawyer. Detective Kowalski leaned back in his chair and said, "That was my right, but it would look better if I cooperated now, if I explained what happened." I repeated that I wanted a lawyer and that I had nothing to explain because I'd been in jail. He left the room. I sat there alone for 20 minutes, staring at the crime scene photos he'd left on the table. Michelle Strand looked young, maybe late 20s, wearing pajama pants and a t-shirt, killed in her own home. Her daughter had witnessed it. Someone had brutally beaten this woman to death, and somehow, evidence was pointing to me. My stomach turned. This wasn't a misdemeanor DUI anymore. This was murder, life in prison, death penalty territory if the prosecution wanted to push for it. And I had no idea how my DNA had gotten to that apartment because I'd never been there, didn't know Michelle Strand, and had been locked in a cell when she was killed. The public defender assigned to my case was a woman named Lisa Hartwick, maybe 40 years old, carrying a worn leather briefcase stuffed with files from dozens of other cases. She'd been practicing criminal defense for 12 years, mostly handling indigent clients with minor charges. She looked exhausted when she sat down across from me in the attorney conference room. I'd been moved from general population to administrative segregation, isolated from other inmates because murder suspects got special housing. Lisa pulled out a legal pad and asked me to walk her through everything. I told her about the DUI arrest, the bench warrant, being taken into custody Monday morning at 8:15 a.m., according to my intake paperwork. I told her I'd been in continuous custody since then, that I'd never left the facility except for my Thursday court appearance, which had been through secure transport. I told her about Detective Kowalski's visit, the DNA evidence, the impossibility of the timeline. Lisa took notes and said she'd pull all the jail records, surveillance footage, guard logs, anything documenting my presence in custody during the time of Michelle Strand's murder. She said that was an ironclad alibi if the documentation supported it. But she also said DNA evidence was powerful, that juries trusted forensic science, and that we needed to understand how the evidence could show I was at the crime scene when I physically wasn't. She asked if I had an identical twin. I didn't. She asked if I had any siblings. I had a younger brother, Kevin, who lived in Seattle. We weren't particularly close, saw each other maybe twice a year at family gatherings. Lisa made a note about Kevin and asked for his contact information. She said we'd need to investigate whether someone could have planted my DNA at the crime scene, whether there'd been contamination at the lab, whether evidence had been mishandled or mislabeled. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following week. The prosecutor, a man named Douglas Finch, who'd handled major crimes in Pierce County for 15 years, filed charges of murder in the first degree with aggravating circumstances due to the presence of a child during the crime. The bail hearing was perfunctory. Douglas argued I was a flight risk and a danger to the community based on the violent nature of the crime. Lisa argued I had an ironclad alibi, and the DNA evidence had to be explained through contamination or error. The judge set bail at $2 million, which might as well have been $2 billion for someone who worked construction and lived paycheck to paycheck. I wasn't getting out. I'd sit in administrative segregation awaiting trial, isolated from general population, because murder suspects couldn't mix with lower-level offenders. Lisa filed motions demanding all evidence related to my custody status during the relevant time period. The jail provided documentation showing I'd been continuously housed in their facility from Monday morning through the present. Intake records showed my arrival time, my booking photo, my fingerprints. Security footage from my cell block showed me present during head counts at 6 a.m., noon, 6 p.m., and 10 p.m. every day, including Wednesday. Guard logs documented routine checks throughout each night, including Wednesday night when Michelle Strand was murdered. My cellmates gave statements confirming I'd been present in the cell Wednesday evening and overnight. The evidence was comprehensive and indisputable. I had not left Pierce County Jail during the time Michelle Strand was killed, but the DNA evidence was equally comprehensive and indisputable. The crime lab report showed DNA recovered from 3 sources at the crime scene matched my profile. The cigarette butt with saliva had been found on the floor near Michelle's body. The blood on the door frame had tested as a mixture, primarily Michelle's blood but with a small amount from a second contributor identified as mine. The epithelial cells under Michelle's fingernails showed she'd scratched her attacker, collecting skin cells that matched my genetic profile. The lab had run the samples twice to confirm accuracy. The probability of the DNA belonging to someone other than me was calculated at 1 in 4.7 billion. The forensic technician who'd processed the evidence, a woman named Dr. Jennifer Ashford, with 18 years of experience in forensic DNA analysis, stated in her report that the match was definitive and that she'd followed all protocols for evidence handling and analysis. Lisa hired an independent forensic expert, Dr. Marcus Chen. Wait, I can't use Marcus or Chen. Let me rename. Lisa hired an independent forensic expert, Dr. Philip Ostrander, who'd worked in forensic science for 25 years and had testified in hundreds of cases. Dr. Ostrander reviewed the crime lab's reports and methodology. He found no evidence of contamination, no suggestion of improper handling, no indication of laboratory error. The DNA testing had been conducted according to standard protocols. The samples had been properly documented through chain of custody. The results were reliable from a technical standpoint. Dr. Ostrander's conclusion was frustrating. The lab had done everything correctly, which meant the DNA recovered from the crime scene genuinely matched my profile. The question wasn't whether the lab made a mistake. The question was how my biological material had gotten to a crime scene when I'd been locked in jail. Lisa explored the possibility of evidence planting. She interviewed the responding officers who'd processed Michelle Strand's crime scene. They'd collected the cigarette butt, photographed the blood on the doorframe, and arranged for the medical examiner to collect the fingernail scrapings during autopsy. The evidence had been sealed in collection bags, logged, and transported to the crime lab by established protocols. The officers had no prior contact with me, no reason to frame me, no access to my DNA. The evidence planting theory required explaining how someone had obtained my saliva, blood, and epithelial cells, then planted them at a crime scene in ways that looked natural and unforced. It required a sophisticated conspiracy that seemed implausible without a clear motive. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. My brother Kevin called Lisa's office after seeing news coverage about my arrest. Kevin said he needed to tell someone something, but he was scared of the implications. Lisa arranged for me to speak with Kevin by phone from the jail. Kevin's voice was shaking when he said my name. He told me our cousin Dylan had contacted him 3 weeks ago asking weird questions. Dylan Brennan was our mother's nephew, 2 years older than me, someone I'd grown up with but hadn't seen in maybe 5 years. Dylan had always been troubled, in and out of jail for theft and drug offenses, unreliable and manipulative. Kevin said Dylan had asked him whether I was working, where I was living, whether I'd gotten into any trouble recently. Kevin hadn't thought much about it at the time, had assumed Dylan wanted to reconnect, or maybe ask for money. But now, with me arrested for murder, Kevin wondered if Dylan had been gathering information about me for some reason. Lisa investigated Dylan Brennan. His criminal record was extensive: theft, burglary, assault, drug possession, parole violations. He'd been released from state prison 8 months ago after serving 3 years for aggravated assault. His last known address was in Tacoma, less than 5 miles from Michelle Strand's apartment. Lisa showed me a photograph of Dylan from his most recent arrest. We looked similar enough that we'd been mistaken for brothers when we were younger. Same general height and build, same coloring, similar facial features. Not identical, but close enough that a traumatized 8-year-old girl witnessing a violent attack in dim lighting might not notice the differences when shown my driver's license photo. Lisa filed a motion demanding the police investigate Dylan Brennan as a potential suspect. She provided documentation of Dylan's criminal history, his physical resemblance to me, his recent contact with Kevin asking questions about me, and his geographical proximity to the crime scene. Detective Kowalski initially dismissed the theory as a desperate attempt to create reasonable doubt, but Lisa pressed harder. She argued that Dylan had motive to frame me, that he could have deliberately planted my DNA at the crime scene, and that the police had an obligation to investigate alternative suspects when presented with credible evidence. She threatened to file a motion to dismiss charges based on prosecutorial misconduct if they refused to investigate. The investigation into Dylan took 3 weeks. Detective Kowalski and his partner interviewed Dylan at his apartment. Dylan denied knowing Michelle Strand. He denied being in her neighborhood on the night of her murder. He said he'd been home alone, playing video games. No alibi. He acted offended by the suggestion he'd frame his cousin for murder. But when police searched Dylan's apartment with a warrant, they found items that shifted the entire case. In Dylan's bedroom closet, they found a dark jacket matching the description Michelle's daughter had given of her attacker. The jacket had been washed, but luminol testing revealed trace amounts of blood in the fabric fibers. DNA analysis confirmed the blood was Michelle Strand's. They also found a pack of cigarettes, the same brand as the cigarette butt recovered from the crime scene. Most damning, they found a small plastic bag containing what looked like hair and dried blood. The bag was labeled with my name. Dylan was arrested and brought in for questioning. With evidence mounting and his public defender advising him to cooperate in exchange for a potential plea deal, Dylan eventually admitted to killing Michelle Strand. His confession revealed a calculated, disturbing plan. Dylan had been following me for weeks after his release from prison. He'd broken into my apartment while I was at work and stolen personal items: my hairbrush with strands of my hair, a razor with trace amounts of my blood from shaving, cigarettes from a pack I'd left on my counter. He'd collected biological samples he could use to plant my DNA. He'd planned to commit a crime and frame me for it, not out of any specific grudge against me, but because he needed a patsy, and I was convenient. Family connection meant he knew enough about my life to track me. Physical resemblance meant witnesses might identify me. Criminal record meant my DNA was already in the system for comparison. Dylan had been watching Michelle Strand, too. She'd testified against one of his friends in a drug case 2 years earlier. Dylan's friend had gone to prison partly because of Michelle's testimony. Dylan saw an opportunity for revenge against Michelle while simultaneously framing me. On Wednesday night, he'd gone to Michelle's apartment. He'd been smoking one of my stolen cigarettes while he waited outside, making sure to leave saliva evidence. When he entered through the unlocked door, he confronted Michelle. She fought back, scratching his arms, but he'd deliberately held the door frame with his hand after cutting himself slightly to leave a blood mixture. The fight escalated. He beat Michelle to death while her daughter hid. Then he left, confident that the DNA evidence would lead police to me while I sat in jail with an alibi that seemed impossible to reconcile with the forensic evidence. Dylan's plan had one fatal flaw. He hadn't anticipated how thoroughly my custody would be documented or how aggressively my attorney would investigate alternative suspects. He'd assumed the DNA evidence would be overwhelming, that my claims of being in jail would seem like lies or impossible circumstances that couldn't be proven. He'd gambled that physical evidence would outweigh alibi documentation. He'd lost that gamble when Lisa refused to accept the impossible contradiction and pushed the investigation toward him. The charges against me were dismissed immediately after Dylan's confession. Douglas Finch, the prosecutor, issued a public apology acknowledging that I'd been wrongfully charged and that the system had failed me. He praised Lisa Hartwick's investigation and said it demonstrated the importance of thorough defense work. I was released from Pierce County Jail after 38 days in custody. The DUI charges were quietly dropped as compensation, though that felt meaningless compared to what I'd endured. I walked out of the facility into afternoon sunlight, my brother Kevin waiting for me in the parking lot. He hugged me hard and apologized for not immediately connecting Dylan's strange questions to something sinister. I told him it wasn't his fault. None of this was his fault. Dylan Brennan was charged with first-degree murder, evidence tampering, and false reporting. His confession detailed how he'd obtained my biological samples, how he'd planted them at the crime scene, how he'd deliberately selected a victim who'd testified against his friend to combine revenge with framing. The judge denied bail. Dylan's trial lasted 2 weeks. The jury deliberated for 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all charges. The sentencing was brutal. The judge called Dylan's actions a calculated betrayal that had not only taken Michelle Strand's life, but had nearly destroyed his innocent cousin's life through deliberate false accusation. Dylan was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole for the murder, plus additional consecutive sentences for the evidence tampering charges. Michelle Strand's daughter, whose name was protected from public records due to her age, was placed with relatives and entered therapy to process the trauma of witnessing her mother's murder. Victim Services reached out to me through Lisa, asking if I'd be willing to provide a statement for the victim impact portion of Dylan's sentencing. I did. I talked about the fear of being accused of a crime I didn't commit, the isolation of solitary confinement, the knowledge that DNA evidence was pointing to me despite the physical impossibility. I said Dylan hadn't just killed Michelle. He'd tried to kill me too, just in a different way. He'd tried to steal my life through false accusation. I said I hoped he spent every day of his life sentence thinking about the lives he'd destroyed. I couldn't return to my construction job. My employer had been supportive during the investigation, but once I was released, the dynamic had changed. Co-workers looked at me differently. Some had seen news coverage showing my mugshot alongside headlines about the murder. Even after my exoneration, even after Dylan's conviction, there was stigma. People wondered if maybe there was more to the story, if maybe I'd been involved somehow. The association between my name and a brutal murder lingered. I resigned 3 months after my release and moved to Spokane, on the opposite side of Washington state, seeking distance from Pierce County and the memories of Michelle's apartment, Dylan's betrayal, and 38 days in administrative segregation. Lisa Hartwick became something of a hero in criminal defense circles. Legal publications wrote articles about the case, analyzing how thorough alibi documentation and aggressive alternative suspect investigation had overturned seemingly definitive DNA evidence. Lisa presented at conferences about false accusations and the importance of questioning forensic evidence even when it appears ironclad. She stayed in touch with me occasionally, checking on how I was adjusting. I told her I was grateful for her work, that she'd saved my life, but that I'd never fully recover from knowing how close I'd come to life in prison for a crime committed by someone who shared my family name and had stolen my DNA. The case changed how I viewed evidence and justice. I'd always trusted that innocent people would be exonerated, that truth would emerge, that the system worked. Sitting in that interrogation room while Detective Kowalski showed me crime scene photos and told me my DNA was at a murder scene had shattered that trust. I'd learned that physical evidence could be manipulated, that someone malicious enough could plant biological material at crime scenes, and that innocent people could be convicted based on science that seemed infallible but wasn't accounting for deliberate fraud. I'd learned that being provably innocent didn't protect you from accusation, that alibi documentation meant nothing if the evidence contradicted it, and that freedom depended on having an attorney willing to fight harder than the system expected. I testified before a state legislative committee examining evidence handling protocols and protections against evidence planting. I described Dylan's method of collecting my biological samples from my apartment and planting them at a crime scene. I explained how easy it had been for him to obtain hair, blood, and saliva from personal items in my home. I advocated for legislation requiring investigation of evidence sourcing in cases where defendants had documented alibis that contradicted physical evidence. The committee passed reforms requiring law enforcement to investigate how biological evidence could have been planted when defendants provided strong proof of being elsewhere during the crime. 3 years after Dylan's conviction, I received a letter from Michelle Strand's sister, a woman named Rebecca Flores. She said she'd been following my advocacy work on wrongful accusations and evidence planting. She thanked me for turning my trauma into action that might protect others. She said her family had been devastated by Michelle's death, but knowing that justice had been achieved and that her killer was in prison for life provided some closure. She said she was sorry I'd been caught in Dylan's conspiracy, that I'd been targeted by the same man who'd killed her sister. She hoped I'd found peace. I wrote back telling her I thought about Michelle often, about her daughter who'd witnessed horror, about the moment Detective Kowalski slid those crime scene photos across the table, and I'd realized my DNA was supposedly everywhere. I told her peace was complicated, that some scars didn't heal, but I was building something from the ruins Dylan had tried to create. I'm working in construction again, in Spokane, building homes for a smaller company where my co-workers don't know my history unless I choose to share it. I've told my story to a few people, carefully, watching their reactions. Most are horrified, some are skeptical. There's always someone who wonders why Dylan went to such lengths. Whether there was bad blood between us I haven't mentioned, whether maybe I'd done something to provoke him. Those questions sting because they suggest I somehow deserved being framed for murder. I didn't. Dylan was a sociopath who saw an opportunity to combine revenge against a witness with framing a convenient relative. That's all. There was no provocation, no secret conflict, just opportunistic malice. Dylan sends letters occasionally from prison. They're manipulative garbage claiming he's found redemption, that he's sorry for what he did, that he hopes I've forgiven him. I don't read them anymore. I have them forwarded to Lisa Hartwick in case they contain anything legally relevant, but I don't need his apologies. He didn't just try to frame me for murder. He murdered an innocent woman to do it. He traumatized a child who watched her mother die. He nearly destroyed my life as collateral damage in his revenge scheme. There's no forgiveness for that. He's serving life without parole. That's where he belongs. 5 years after my arrest, I spoke at a criminal justice reform conference about the fragility of innocence in the face of physical evidence. I told the story of being in jail while my DNA was supposedly at a crime scene, of the impossibility that nearly convicted me, of the lawyer who refused to accept the contradiction. I ended by saying that I didn't need to hurt Dylan. The truth did it for me. The evidence that was supposed to destroy me ultimately destroyed him when investigators followed it to its source. Justice worked, slowly and imperfectly, but it worked. That has to be enough. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.